Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Super excited for today's episode because really this marks the second episode in our new segment of our podcast, which is more so content focused, right? So 2 episodes ago, we talked about how to learn content. And then last episode, we dove in with arguably the hardest episode we could have possibly done, right? Which was fluids. And you're drinking fluid. So there you go. Perfect.
The only fluid that matters to me, Fresca.
We got to get you sponsored by Fresca, Mike. You talk about it way too much not to get to the sponsorship.
One day. That's actually my dream. Because I go to Costco and that's one of the main things. But my Costco doesn't carry it anymore, so I have to go to the grocery store to get it. Right next to it. But yeah, oh my goodness. If I have it just Fresca in the fridge, I'm happy. Anyway, we're not talking about Fresca today, but sponsor me.
We are talking about fluids though, and Fresca, like we talked about, is in some ways a fluid in a fluid, right?
Interesting.
Fresca has bubbles, right?
I see where you're going with this. I was like, what are you I get what you're doing. Okay.
Common misconception here. A lot of people hear fluids and they're like, oh, water, right? Blood is a fluid, right? They're not thinking about things like air, right? Or carbonation. But air is also a fluid, right?
And
it flows. Yes, this is one of our key components of last class, right? Or last podcast episode, which felt like
too many classes. We do too many classes.
Yeah. We talked about what a fluid is, right? The fact that fluids flow. We talked about density. We talked about pressure. We talked about Bernoulli's equation. We talked about the continuity equation, all of these amazing things. And again, last episode, we were very focused on applications of that material, right? I don't want this podcast to sound like we're just reading from a textbook. We want to make it fun, and we want to focus on how you can truly understand this. And in that same vein, right,
I see what you did there. That totally flew over my head at first. It flew because fluids. But then yeah.
I apologize in advance to everyone listening. We have too much fun. In that same, rhythm that we had last episode, this episode we're going to also be focusing on applications of fluids. This time though within the human body, right? So we will be talking about the cardiovascular system. Right. Of course, we've got fluid, blood flowing through our veins, right? Pumped by the heart.
Are you serious?
Mike's hearing this for the first time.
This makes so much sense.
Now I finally get it.
Yeah, I get it.
The cardiovascular system, and we'll also talk about the respiratory system, right? Which is ultimately how air is going to flow into and out of the body. We'll talk about the different layers of that. We'll talk about bulk flow, like physically getting air into the lungs to where we have our nice little alveoli lining, right, where gas exchange will actually take place. And then we'll also talk a little bit about how the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system kind of interlock.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be super fun.
And I think before this, you really were very passionate about a certain subject area that I know you really want that we'll talk about. For preface, not nearly as in love with it as you are, but when I hear you talk about it, I'm like, wow, this is so cool. So, Molly, tell us about how we even got our lungs in the first place.
Yes. Okay. So for context for our listeners, I've been a teacher for years and years, ever since I was in college, and I actually taught the sophomore biology series when I was a junior and senior in college, which was cell bio, it was genetics, it was all this fun stuff, but it was also ecology and evolution. And I think it is so cool in talking about the cardiovascular and respiratory system to talk about why we have lungs at all and why our cardiovascular system looks the way that it does. Because I think, 1, it's awesome. And 2, it makes it much more easy to learn. So let's peel back some layers, right? Let's travel just a brief 420 million years ago to when the very first fish, our ancestral tetrapod, walked, right? This brand new thing of living on land comes with a lot of unforeseen costs, right?
Hmm.
When we lived in the water and we had air dissolved in the water, a lot of fish living at that time could absorb oxygen into their body, actually just using their skin or using diffusion, right? Where
Wait,
things
you're
spread
telling me
out.
they breathe just through our skin, like just through the skin?
Yeah,
Kind of
but
cool.
actually, we have land animals that do that too, right? I'm looking at you, amphibians. Um,
Oh, of course. Of course. The
of
amphibian
course, of
who
course.
doesn't know about the amphibians breathing through their
Tune me
skin,
out, tune me out.
right?
Let's get back to our ancestral tetrapod, right? That ultimately had to evolve lungs. That was the most important adaptation to allow that fish to climb out on land because suddenly we have to get air from, or we have to get oxygen from the air around us, right? The issue is we don't have a mechanism at that time to essentially suck air into our body and then allow it to leave,
Hmm.
which is what we're going to talk about in a few minutes when we get
Hmm.
into the mechanism of respiration. But we needed to evolve lungs for that reason, not just lungs, right, which are essentially giant air sacs. We also need a conducting tube that's stiff, right, which would be our trachea. We also need a very muscular diaphragm, right, which is going to be that layer of skeletal muscle underneath the lungs that's going to contract and pull downward to expand the chest cavity. And we needed protective ribs, right? So the entire respiratory tract as we know it had to evolve because of the differences in living in water versus living on land, which is pretty awesome. Even the cardiovascular system had to adapt, right? Because suddenly, now that we're out on land, we have additional forces, right? Creating pressures on our body, right? We have the hydrostatic pressure that's associated with all that air, right? Pulling us down, ultimately pulling all of our blood down to our feet, right? Which would be where it's closest to the earth.
Hmm.
Which is kind of a problem because we need blood to flow everywhere, especially our brain, which eventually evolved to be as far from the ground as it can be for us, animals that walk on two legs. So
Hmm.
a lot of what we see in our cardiovascular system, right, our extra strong four-chambered heart, our very, very thick, muscular, elastic walls of our arteries, and our valves with veins, all are the way that they are because we climbed out of the ocean, right? And we had to now deal with very different conditions from life in the water. And that is seen. I will stop talking about that kind of stuff now.
No, you know what? Well, I so appreciate you bringing this up because, again, we can take that, like, that context when we're learning about the cardiovascular and the respiratory system, because this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about learning, right? We have such this habit of like memorizing, oh, the cardio and respiratory system, but if we take it from this context of like evolutionary biology, we can just kind of we contextualize that all of these things arose for a reason. There's a
Mm-hmm.
reason we have that protective rib cage. There's a reason that we have this very stiff trachea, right? Again, when you think about the reasons, oh my goodness. Like again, it just all makes sense. You don't have to like wonder, oh, let me just memorize the whole system. It just obviously we need this.
Yeah.
So I love thinking about this way. Thank you so much for bringing it up. But now we want to focus on the stuff the MCAT's going to talk about because again,
Yeah.
for reference, FYI for anyone listening, they're not going to test you on tetrapods. While very very interesting, tetrapods is not MCAT testable content. I feel like I had to put that preface on there because I'm like if
Yes.
someone's writing down like okay, learn about the tetrapods.
Yes. Scratch it out. Scratch it out.
But let's start at the respiratory system. Molly, take us through like what's going on? What's going on that we need to know?
Yeah. So let's start with the basics, right? We know that all of our cells need oxygen, right? And I think we get so used to the fact that we breathe air and we need oxygen and we need to expel carbon dioxide, but I don't think everyone has fully connected why.
Mhm.
Because the reason why we need oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide leaving actually is not as much a biology thing, right? It's more of a biochemical thing, right?
Mm.
Because Or Mike, do you want to say, why do we need oxygen? Why do we make carbon dioxide?
Well, I mean, I'm always thinking about aerobic respiration when I think about that. I'm thinking because we are, us as human beings, there's a lot going on in our cells. There's a lot of processes. We are fundamentally extremely complex. The fact I can speak, I can hear, I can listen to you requires so much energy that we don't even realize. And so we need things to create that energy. Now, things
Mhm.
that don't need oxygen are still able to make energy, but not nearly as much as we can when we have oxygen. This is related to aerobic respiration. This is related to the mitochondria, glycolysis. Like all of these kind of pieces are why we actually need oxygen. We are going to dive in. I think we're talking about aerobic respiration
In a couple
a couple
episodes.
episodes. We're going to really dive in and break it down, but kind of contextualizing the why. Like, okay, we need it. Everyone knows we need oxygen, but why do we need oxygen? I think is really cool to think about.
Yeah, it's actually part of our electron transport chain. It's our terminal electron acceptor. And if that sounds like gibberish, subscribe
Stay
to the
tuned.
podcast. Stay tuned because we will talk about that in a couple episodes here. But we breathe oxygen because our cells need it to make ATP, right? Cellular energy. So we need a way to get air from or oxygen from the air around us into our body and ultimately to every single one of your cells, right? That's a big task. That's a really big task. And so we've evolved both of these systems to help us do that, right? The respiratory system is all about getting air from the outside environment into your body, right? Again, we talked about how we breathe in through the mouth and the nose, right? We travel through the oropharynx and the nasopharynx and the laryngopharynx, right? That are all kind of in our throat, right? Into our trachea, right? And then we spread out, we continue to branch and branch and branch into our lungs. Okay. So most of the places that the air is flowing through actually have nothing to do with gas exchange or transfer of oxygen into the blood, right? Most of what we're doing in our respiratory system is what we call bulk flow. It's literally just get air from outside inside, right? Gas exchange occurs specifically at the very tips of our, bronchial tree, right? Right. Our trees in our lungs just branches and branches and branches, right? The alveoli, little air sacs, people call them clusters of grapes. That's where gas exchange will actually happen, and you'll have oxygen move into the blood, carbon dioxide will flow out. But most of the respiratory system is literally just, you know, directing air inside. And the way that we do that actually applies to physics and fluids quite extremely.
Super cool. Super cool. And I love before we even like tell the why, I challenge everyone. And this is always my challenge. Whenever I teach a class on this, I always challenge everyone. Right now, take a deep breath. What? Now breathe out. What happened when we kind of took that breath in to your chest? What happened to your chest?
Got bigger.
It got way bigger, right? And when you breathed out, what happened to your chest?
It fell back down.
Came back in, right? I love the respiratory system because you can actually like practice it.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also challenge you to do this. Try to breathe without moving your chest.
It's really
Yeah,
hard.
right. If for anyone who's not watching, both of us just like stood at the camera and just tried to breathe and we couldn't. It's like, why can't I breathe? Right? We need to be able to move our chest in order to breathe air. And this is where the physics comes in, right? Again,
Mm-hmm.
so Molly, when we're like breathing in, why do we breathe in? So what causes this? Why couldn't I breathe when I didn't allow my chest to move?
Yeah, so this all has to do with the mechanism for inspiration. And I don't mean like, oh, I feel so inspired.
I
Like
am so
literally
inspired.
inspiration, meaning respiration, and specifically the part where you bring air in, right? Believe it or not, this is not because the air is forcing itself down, your trachea into your lungs. It's actually because it's being sucked in from the outside environment. And it has to do with a physics concept, right? Which is the relationship between pressure and volume. We're
Mhm.
not going to get too in depth with the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT, but what you do want to know is that assuming everything else is equal, right? If your volume gets bigger,
Mhm.
pressure gets smaller,
Mhm.
right? That's called Boyle's law, right?
Mhm.
Pressure or volume gets bigger, pressure gets smaller. So when we expand our chest cavity, right? And specifically, this is done when you take that dome shaped diaphragm that is right up against the lungs, right? Separating the abdominal cavity from the thoracic or chest cavity. When that contracts, it flattens out downwards.
Mhm.
And at the same time, you've got all these muscles between your ribs that are contracting and pulling your ribs higher, called
Mhm.
intercostal muscles. Both of those processes are expanding the chest cavity in terms of its volume.
Mhm.
And that is creating a system of very low pressure in your chest.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, how is that going to create air movement to have low
Well,
pressure?
well, so glad you asked, Molly. Because again, this is the idea where by changing that pressure inside your lungs, it's always important to think about pressure differences when talking about flow. Like again, we
Mm-hmm.
talked about it before with Bernoulli's before about like different pressures, but here is the same situation where now what you've done by expanding the volume of your lungs, right? You have now decreased the pressure and then compared to the atmospheric pressure, it's much lower. It is much lower than atmospheric pressure. And what we know about fluids is fluids always follow pressure gradients. They always go
Mm-hmm.
from high pressure to low pressure. It's why planes fly. Again, I'm bringing back the planes from last episode. They always go from that high pressure below the wing to low pressure above the wing. That's why you have lift. But it's the same way when we breathe. Right? By increasing the volume of our thoracic cavity, decreasing the pressure, air now flows down its pressure gradient from outside in. This
Mm-hmm.
process of breathing is known as a negative pressure breathing, right? Where we have caused negative pressure in the lungs, again, by bringing it down below atmospheric. And so it blows
Relative, yeah. Negative
relative
relative to outside.
atmospheric, absolutely. And then it goes down that into our lungs. Again, when I was younger, especially, I always thought my lungs expanded because air was going into it.
Me
But
too. Yep.
it's actually the whole other way around. My lung expands so that air can go into it. Right? It's that kind of idea that I think is really important, especially with respiration, because there are so many questions that ask about this kind of pressure difference, especially with breathing. So no, 100%. And it's why when we didn't allow our chest to move,
Mm-hmm.
right? Did we create that pressure gradient?
No, we did not.
Well, so then is there any surprise that we're not being able to breathe at that point?
No way.
No.
Yeah, and
So
this
mhm.
also, oh,
I was
after
just
you.
gonna say that's really cool. But anyway.
It is really cool. See, we
Yeah.
needed to address that. It's awesome. And it also leads us to how exhalation works, right? Inhalation is a very active process because we've got intercostal muscles.
Mhm.
Inter between costal is your ribs, right? Your intercostal muscles are contracting to bring your rib cage up and out, which expands your chest cavity. And that diaphragm, that skeletal muscle right underneath your lungs, is contracting downwards, which also is expanding your lungs. And in both situations, we have muscular contraction, right? That's an
Mhm.
active process. It requires energy. When we talk about exhalation, though, this is actually a totally passive process, right?
Mhm.
We're not forcing air out. You can if you really want to, but
Right. Yeah.
normal breathing, you're not, right? It's very passive. What we're going to see is that diaphragm, it's flattened out right now because it was contracted to bring air in. Now we've got air. We're ready to breathe back out. The diaphragm is simply going to relax back up towards its dome-shaped structure. And our intercostal muscles are contracted, holding our rib cage up and out. They're also just going to relax, right? And in doing so, the two processes that expanded our lungs, it's going to essentially relax and fall back to how it was before, creating another pressure gradient,
Mhm.
right? Now we have the volume getting smaller, which increases the pressure according to Boyle's law. And now air is going to flow back out into atmospheric pressure, right?
Mhm.
So atmospheric pressure is not changing, but the whole point of the respiratory system is to change the system of pressures in your body
Mhm.
to either direct air in or
Mhm.
direct air out.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Which I think again, still the idea that yeah, by like collapsing the chest there, it's not like you are causing the air by like pushing the air out. All you're doing is increasing the pressure, and allow that pressure gradient to do its job. It's not really because of the muscles that are pushing out. It's not like we're squeezing because of the muscles, but it's rather because of this pressure gradient. Because again, if the outside atmosphere for some reason got extremely high pressure, just because your lungs are essentially getting smaller, if the outside was like a really high pressure, the air wouldn't come out. because it needs that pressure gradient, right, in order to
Mhm.
flow out. It's not just because the lungs are pushing them out. It needs to have that gradient, which I think once by connecting these gradients to lungs, I think respiration on the lungs, if you understand that, I think on the MCAT, I don't know what kind of question you wouldn't be able to answer if you really understand that.
I agree. And I think a cool application, well, it's actually not cool at all. It's horrific, but
Mhm.
an interesting application of this in a medical context is actually, have you heard of a collapsed lung before?
Of
Say you
course.
get stabbed in the chest,
Hmm.
right? You can have a collapsed lung, and your lung, like if you were to look at it, and I
Hmm.
think a lot of us from childhood can remember, at least I assume this is in Canada too. It was very prevalent in America to look at like healthy lungs versus like smokers' lungs.
Oh yeah,
How much
sure.
they're smaller, they're darker, right? When we collapse our lung, it looks a lot like the other situation, right? Much smaller, physically smaller. Um,
Hmm.
and that's because that stab wound has essentially created a pathway for air to equilibrate in terms of the pressures, right? Like your body is trying to expand the chest cavity to create that sucking, right, negative pressure breathing to force air in because the pressure is dropping. But as your chest is moving, right, you have an option for air to come in and essentially totally negate that. So you're
Hmm.
breathing, your diaphragm is contracting, your intercostal muscles are contracting, your chest is changing size, but you're never getting air moving into where it needs to because
Hmm.
it's essentially just moving in and out of that little hole in your chest,
Hmm.
right? It's remaining equal, which of course a collapsed lung is a medical emergency.
Of
You
course.
obviously need medical attention urgently because you are not getting enough air to properly oxygenate your blood, which
Hmm.
means, again, all of those cells,
Hmm.
particularly in your heart and your brain, that require a ton of energy in the form of ATP, can't make ATP, right?
Right.
It is a medical emergency because what we've essentially done in having a stab wound, right, is eliminate that pressure difference,
That's
right?
yeah.
Which is
Hmm.
so, again, it's medically fascinating. I won't say it's cool because no one
Hmm.
wants pneumothorax,
Of
which is
course.
a collapsed lung.
Hmm.
But as future physicians, I applied this at the beginning of today's class. I applied it to something that I nerd out about, which is tetrapod evolution and evolution of life on Earth. Don't laugh at me, Mike. But I think a very common ground for a lot of us pre-meds would be to find a medical or clinical application of this stuff. So always when you're learning material, I don't want you to just take it at face value and say, oh, I need to just memorize negative pressure breathing, boring. Find some way to make it fun, right?
Hmm.
And again, applying it to a medical context, I think is a pretty common ground that we can all get on.
Yeah, we're all a fan of medicine, and but we're all that's all our futures, right? And I think this also
Exactly.
reminds us about why we study for the MCAT, right?
Hmm.
I think it's always I'm a big like mindset person when it comes to studying for the MCAT, where
Yeah.
it's not like oh you have to study for the MCAT. No, you get to study for the MCAT, right? This is the stuff that's going to be foundational for your future knowledge as a physician. Some of this physics stuff, right? I get all the time like, why do I need to know about physics? Well, because there's absolutely applications of medicine.
Yes.
Why do I need to know about voltage and things? Well, your electron transport chain is all about electric potential. So again, it all connects. And so thinking about it in a medical perspective, I think really helps to motivate us to like, oh, I should probably really try to understand this. But yeah, no, 100% pneumothorax is a very it's a great application of our knowledge, of course, horrific. But it's a great application of this idea of you need that pressure gradient in order for air to flow in. You have a stab wound in the chest, you're not able to create that pressure gradient anymore, no breathing is going to occur. Another great application you're going to see, and I know, Molly, you have a lot of experience with this one in working in this field, is ventilation, like ventilators, right? Because they actually work via a different mechanism, right? Where they actually work by positive pressure breathing, right? Which is really interesting. Talk to me again, because again, I know you have a lot of experience with it. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've never used one of these myself. There are medical grade ones, ventilators that individuals who need to take some of the pressure off their lungs to oxygenate can use that are in the hospital for individuals who are, let's say, in a coma or in some sort of dire medical emergency. And then there are actually other types that are very commonplace. And I will offer this up as a personal experience using a CPAP machine. I don't use it myself, but my dad, who snores so loud,
Yep.
he has a very common condition, I guess you'd call it, called sleep apnea, where
Hmm.
you go through periods of time when you sleep where you actually stop breathing, which is obviously not great. It jolts you
Not ideal.
awake. The hypoxia from not breathing suddenly when you sleep wakes you up, right? And so you get really poor sleep quality. And one of the ways that we get around this is through what's called a CPAP machine, which is continuous positive airway pressure. So it's basically, rather than the negative pressure that we create when we breathe, you wear a mask that is essentially constantly creating that positive pressure that's pushing air into your lungs, right? So even if you stop sucking air in when you're breathing, as we know it, stops, you're still getting oxygenated, and it can help individuals with sleep apnea sleep through the night, because if they go through a period where they stop having that mechanism of inspiration and expiration, the CPAP machine will help keep them oxygenated until they're doing it again. A ventilator is going to be very different, because ultimately that individual doesn't just go through periods where they are not expanding and contracting their chest cavity. That individual is not doing it at all, right?
Hmm.
So that is going to be a different mechanism, but kind of the same idea, right?
Hmm.
But yeah, CPAP machines, they're everywhere. A lot of
Oh
people
man.
have them nowadays.
Yeah,
Sleep
friends of
apnea is
mine.
pretty
Yeah,
common.
a friend of mine, a good friend of mine uses one as well. But I think again, really cool to see these different applications, but the same fundamental principles. Because again, that's what the MCAT loves to do. They like taking your fundamental like knowledge. Again, that's why we always want to be understanding rather than memorizing, and applying it to scenarios that you might not be familiar with. Because
Yes.
like CPAP, for example, it's still a pressure gradient. It's still going from high pressure to low pressure, except instead of your lungs creating that pressure difference, it's not like we're negative pressure now. It's now the ventilator causing a higher pressure outside, kind of forcing it to go in using that pressure gradient. So it's a different sort of like, obviously, it's not the lungs creating that pressure difference, but it's the same fundamental principles, which I
Yeah.
think are so, so cool and always so, so interesting when learning about this content because so often we just memorize, like, oh, negative pressure in the lungs. But as soon as it's presented in a different context, as soon as they put a twist on it, you know, it hits the fan, and now we're like, oh, I don't, what do I even do now? It's like I don't know anything, but it's because
Yeah.
how we approach it when we learn it. So no, 100%. Like again, these new scenarios, and I think it's also really cool to know. So because if this is something that's very common that you see around it, like understanding these things, I think is really good to know. Cool.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the applications that you learn are ultimately the situations that will jog your memory when you're around them. So if
Mhm.
you can attach your knowledge of MCAT relevant physics and fluid dynamics and all that stuff to things that you will see all the time in your
Like
medical
Fresca.
practice,
I mean, not yeah.
like Fresca, like Fresca, yes, like Fresca, of course. How could I forget? Mike anxiously sips his Fresca. You know what? If you attach your understanding of fluids to Fresca, every time you have a Fresca, you'll be prompted to remember it, and it's going to really stick in your brain. It's just like a spaced repetition flashcard, but instead
Oh,
of
we
having
love
to
it.
open Anki, you just look around your
Right.
environment. So I love that. Or you take a sip of your Fresca, of
All
course.
right, to just remind to jog my memory. But yeah, no,
Yes.
and now so now we know how like the air gets in the lungs, right? It's a pressure gradient. Either we're under standard conditions and we create that pressure gradient ourselves, or maybe we need a ventilator and it creates that positive pressure. But now that the air is in the lungs, you were talking about before these alveoli, right? Like that,
Mhm.
this is where the actual like functional part of the lungs happen. Everything else is kind of just dead space or bulk flow, where
Mhm.
not really much occurs. They're just kind of like branches or pathways to get there. I always think
Yeah.
about they're like the roads. Like you don't do anything on a road except drive on a road, right? You don't actually
No.
like. Yeah, you don't buy anything. You're not. That's not the destination isn't the road. The destination is the destination. The destination in the lungs is the alveoli. And
I like
so yeah, that's how. Oh, stop. Thanks. But now that we're at the alveoli, right? Alveoli are very intentionally made. You mentioned before it's this grape structure, right? Because again, I
that.
remember I learned it in high school, and I remember the first time looking at alveoli, I'm like, that's just a bushel of grapes, right?
Yep.
But
It really does look like that.
but again, always thinking back to my like evolutionary biology, there is a reason it looks like that bushel of grapes. Again, Molly, why is it that we have these alveoli that looks like just a whole bunch of circles?
So, good question. Ultimately, it has to do with surface area, right?
Mhm.
And it's kind of the same reason why we can't breathe in through our skin, right, compared to the volume of cells that we need to support with oxygen, we actually have very little surface area, right? We talk about the surface area to volume ratio. Surface area meaning like the actual surface of your skin, or whatever is facing the environment. You want that to be really high. You want a really high surface area. So the reason why we go from basically, a giant tube of your trachea into these teeny, 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 teeny little passageways that end in these grape-like clusters, is to really boost the surface area of the lung, right? Which gives you a lot of space for that oxygen to move from the alveoli itself, from that little air sac, they call it, which is the grape, into all of the capillary beds that surround it, right? Capillaries being that narrowest place in our blood vessel system, right? Very, very small. And we have essentially a net around every single one of these grapes, essentially, right? Where ultimately each alveolus is encapsulated in this little net of capillaries that will allow, again, a very high surface area for that oxygen to diffuse into the lungs. And then carbon dioxide from the blood itself can actually come into the alveolus, the lung itself, and then ultimately in exhalation, leave the body. So the capillary bed that surrounds that alveolus is really where the magic happens. That's going to connect the respiratory system, which, like you said, the majority is what we call the conducting zone. It's not meant for gas exchange. Its job is to just get you there. It's the highway in your analogy, right? The respiratory zone is very small, and it really has to do with the very, very ends of our lungs, right? Those alveoli and where it interfaces with that vasculature, right? Which would be the capillaries. And we're actually going to talk about this in a lot more depth next episode. Again, you got to stay tuned for our series because every episode builds on each other. We'll talk about homeostasis and equilibrium next episode. But that's kind of the connection there, which kind of tees us up to talk about now the cardiovascular system, which is exciting.
They're so interlinked, those two systems, right? I think because I think a lot of times we learn them separately. Like, oh, the respiratory system is one thing, cardiovascular system is one thing, but they rely so heavily on one another. Like I remember I was like working when I was like shadowing, and like I shadowed a cardiologist for some time, and him and the respirologist always like butt heads because when prescribing medications, a lot of the times when you prescribe a medication for heart medications, it actually has some impacts on the respiratory system, where the respirologist then has to like try to treat that, but like, oh, stop doing this medication, but then they like butt heads on treatment plans because of risk benefit. But it kind of always reminds me that these two systems are just so interconnected. The lungs would be absolutely useless without the cardiovascular system, and the cardiovascular system would be essentially pointless without the lungs.
Yeah.
Right? And so thinking about these two things in pairs, I think, is such a great way to learn them as we transition into the cardiovascular system from the respiratory system. Goodness, words.
Yeah. It all comes back to our ancestral tetrapods. It really does.
Oh God, not this again.
Oh, come on, sip your Fresca. Right. I mean, ultimately, when we came out from the water, our ultimate goal is I need to get oxygen from the outside environment into interface with every single cell in my body, right? You need the respiratory system to get air into the bloodstream, but then really, you have cells that are incredibly far away from your actual alveoli, right? You need a system that will deliver it to everywhere it's supposed to go. So this is where the cardiovascular system comes in, right? Ultimately, blood, being a fluid, is meant to flow through the vasculature, right? We could talk about arteries, right, that are closest to the heart, right, going away. We could talk about arterioles, which is arteries that narrow a little bit, right? We have a lot we could actually talk about with arterioles, but just to give an overview, right? Those are going to continue to branch into this giant net called a capillary, right? Which is what we talked about as far as what will absorb the air or the oxygen from our lungs, the alveolus, into the bloodstream, and of course will eject carbon dioxide, so to speak. And then from there, from that capillary bed, right, we will sort of start merging back into venules and then into veins and then back to the heart, right? And so we talk about vasculature as essentially a way to deliver oxygen and carbon dioxide through the blood. Now, of
Right.
course, we have a lot of other stuff that flow through our blood, right?
So many
Hormones. We could talk about, waste
nutrients, all those things.
products, nutrients, all of that, right?
Hmm.
There's a lot, of
Yeah.
course. Your blood is just the highway system, but they are so interlocked because of
Hmm.
how vital oxygen is to the survival of all of us, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think it's also really cool to think about. We have like different circuits when it comes to the heart, and but each circuit still follows the same game plan. Each
Hmm.
circuit still goes artery, arterial, capillary, venule, vein, back to the heart, right?
Yes.
Both circuits do it, but what's very interesting in how these circuits differ, right? In like in terms of these ones. So I usually like saying, I don't know about you, Molly. I like always starting when it comes to like the circuitry of the heart, always starting at the right atria. I don't know about
Okay.
you, but like yeah, I kind of want to start at the right atria, and like what happens there, right? Because again, this is where your inferior vena cava and your superior vena cava first enter the heart, right? From
Yes.
this is the deoxygenated blood from the whole, from your toes, from everywhere else. We're now in the right atria.
Yes.
Now what?
So again, coming from the body, coming from the superior vena cava, right? You've got your head and neck, which obviously require a lot of
A lot of blood.
nutrients and then produce a lot of waste. And then also inferior gathering from pretty much everyone else, right? You have all of this blood coming into your heart that is depleted of everything useful and has a very high volume of a lot of stuff we want to get rid of, right? Metabolites, different waste products. It's coming into your right atrium, and then we're going to flow from the atria, which, to give you a little background about the heart before we get into the circuit, atria are at the top,
Mhm.
ventricles are at the bottom. Your heart
Mhm.
is also, so it's divided top and bottom. It's also
Mhm.
divided into left and right.
Mhm.
So we're talking about the right side of the heart, and on the superior aspect, right, which would be the atrium.
Mhm.
Blood is flowing into this right atrium, and it's going to need to go into the ventricles. Now, we
Mhm.
could talk about the electrical conducting system of the
Oh,
heart,
that would be
but
a little much. That would
that
be a
would be
little
a little
much
much. We'll
for.
save that for another episode,
Mhm.
right? What you need to know is that there's a door between the two called the
Mhm.
tricuspid valve. It's going to push out and allow that blood to go from atria into the ventricles,
Mhm.
right? The ventricles really the primary
Really.
contractile part of the heart, but keep in mind your heart is beating. That ventricle is going to contract, squeezing blood out through the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. Keep in mind,
Mhm.
arteries go away from the heart. Arteries
Oh,
away.
that's a good one. I like that.
You've never heard that before?
I have never. I've always just known. Oh, arteries just like that's always just been a fact to me. Like it's never been like
Oh,
something. Oh, I had to have a little mnemonic for it. But I've never actually
arteries
thought. Oh,
away.
arteries away. Oh, that's cool. I always think like efferent, afferent. I think like oh, like afferent. Well, afferent's coming in, efferent's going away. But I have a different mnemonic for that, which I don't want to say. Uh,
We'll talk about that with kidneys.
yeah.
Yeah, arteries away. I
Mhm.
don't want you guys, so everyone listen up. I don't want you thinking all arteries have oxygenated blood, because
Mhm.
this one doesn't.
Mhm.
Keep in mind, the right side of the heart is accepting blood from all over the body, and this blood has no oxygen. It has way higher carbon dioxide than your average, and it's got a bunch of waste products. Okay, so it's flowing out from the right side into the lungs.
Mhm.
Okay, using that pulmonary artery, which has deoxygenated blood, right? But
Mhm.
it's going away to the lungs.
Mhm.
Then it's going to flow from those pulmonary arteries, which is large, into arterioles, into
Mhm.
capillaries that will ultimately surround those alveolar
That'll be a lot.
sacs, those little
Connections,
grapes.
right?
Carbon dioxide leaves, oxygen comes in.
Mhm.
Now we have fewer wastes, and we now have oxygen that can then go and support the cell, right? Or the cells of the body in general.
Mhm.
So we're in the lungs.
Mhm.
Then we're going to come back into venules. Again, we have all these tiny, tiny, tiny little capillaries, very, very thin, fusing into venules and then
Mhm.
into veins,
Mhm.
right? And then we're on our way back to the heart. So, how
Right.
do we do that?
All right, so now we are back. We kind of like because what we've just described is the pulmonary circuit, right? That
Mhm.
but pulmonary, the Latin for like lung. When you hear pulm, think lung. But we've just gone from the right atria, that upper chamber on the right side, to the lungs, traded out that CO2 for oxygen. So now we have oxygenated blood traveling via venules and veins. This is also one of those kind of situations because normally when you think of venules, veins, you think, oh, deoxygenated blood. But the pulmonary circuits, this is where everything's flipped. This is where we now have oxygenated blood in a venule and vein. This is the only time where this is okay. Any other time, probably not okay. But this is where it is okay. And so now we come back into the left atrium. So this is like kind of the mirror of the right atrium, but on the left side. And so now we are at the left atrium. And now from the left atrium, it squeezes. Again, it's not just the ventricles that squeeze. So the atria do squeeze a little bit, but not nearly as strongly as the ventricles. And so it squeezes its blood through another valve, but instead of the tri, it's the bicuspid valve. I always kind of think you try before you buy. When you think like you try something before you buy it.
Or tricuspid is on the right side. There's an R, it's on the right.
Oh, that's a cool. I've never thought of that one. I always just thought try before you buy, but whatever you buy, whatever is, I don't know. I'm done with that one. But it goes from the left atria through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Now the left ventricle, this is the beefy one. Like this, of the two ventricles, the ventricles are both quite muscular, but I think the right ventricle only has to go to the lungs, right? The lungs, not that far away from the heart. It's like not nearly as muscular. It's still got some muscle, but the left ventricle, oh my goodness, that thing is muscular. And that's the one, because its job isn't just to go to the lungs, right? It doesn't just go like a few, I don't know, not even a meter away, but it goes the whole body. It generates pressure for the entire body, so it has to be strong, right? So this is where the left ventricle is now going to contract extremely tightly, and then it's going to push the blood through the aorta, right? That's that big artery that extends out of the left ventricle to the whole rest of the body. This is where that high pressure comes from. And this is where, again, the aorta is extremely thick so that it can withstand this really high pressure that will go and drive the pressure down its gradient through the rest of the body. Again, go through arteries, go through arterioles, but again, here we have oxygenated blood. Because again, it's going away from the heart, it's an artery or arterial, but it's oxygenated from the lungs. It'll go to the target, whether that be the toes or it be the fingers or the brain, have that gas exchange, that waste exchange, and then continue on through the venules, kind of all collect to the veins. But now again, we've already exchanged the gas. Now again, we talk about gas exchange in the lungs. That's when the blood became oxygenated. Now we're exchanging it with the cells that actually need the oxygen. So now it's become deoxygenated, and again we'll talk about homeostasis and equilibrium and hemoglobin another day, but then now it's on its way back to the heart, but now it's deoxygenated with the venules and the veins, and now we are back to where we started, right, which is the inferior and superior vena cava, and now we're back in the right atria.
I love it.
I love this holistic kind of view of it because it kind of like brings it all like full circle, right? We talked about the pulmonary circuit, and what we've just described is the systemic circuit. And that is our circulatory system because it is a circuit that's always kind of flowing.
Yeah, I love it. And again, I love that you bring in that we kind of have to pick our battles because everything is connected to everything, right? But if we're thinking in this episode all about the applications of what we talked about before with fluids and pressures, I think it's very important to recognize that, right? Like you said, the pulmonary circuit is all really on the same plane, right? It's going from the heart basically just to the right and left side, right? Same height above the ground, same everything. It's very, couple centimeters, not inches for Canadians, centimeters away.
Yeah.
And it's, again, just going to flow from the lungs right back into the heart. It doesn't need a very high pressure, and therefore the right ventricle doesn't need a very muscular wall. The left ventricle, though, right, has to create intensely high pressures because not only does it have to get blood all the way up to the tip of your head, right, and your scalp and your hair follicles up there, like literally as far up as you could go in your body, but it also has to go down. And it might seem easy. Oh, it's just flowing down to the body. Gravity will help. And yes, that's true. But you are losing pressure as you get further and further from the heart, and especially as you narrow. And then you have to think all that blood at your toes has to come back up to your heart. We know a lot about hydrostatic pressure, right? And essentially potential energy density and Bernoulli's equation. The force of gravity pulling that blood down is really intense, right? And your heart, that left ventricle, has to be muscular enough to create such intense pressure that it can actually not just bring you down to your destination, but all the way back up. And
Mm.
this hits at a very important feature of our arteries and our veins that allow it to respond to this pressure difference, right?
Mhm.
Arteries that go away from the heart, if the heart is the pump that's creating the pressure, arteries, given that they're what you go in as soon as you leave the heart, as you go away from the heart, have very high pressure. And as a result, they have to have very thick, muscular, elastic walls, right? If you
Mhm.
think of your heartbeat, like, bum, 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 coming off your chest, right? Imagine a tiny little heartbeat of blood flowing through your arteries, right? They
Mhm.
need to be very elastic to expand and contract with that extra fluid flowing through every time your heart beats. And they have to be very strong because, and in this case, I have a pretty gnarly medical story. You don't want those walls to rupture.
Ooh.
If you've ever gotten a cut,
Mhm.
most often the blood comes out very, very slowly, right?
Mhm.
It's a venous or a capillary
Mhm.
cut,
Mhm.
right? So it's like, oh, the blood is at very low pressure coming out. It's just kind of oozing.
Mhm.
If you nick an artery, it is so high pressure that, again, kind of like with the lung, if you give it an opportunity to equalize the pressure from where it's very high to where it's very low in the atmosphere comparatively, it's going to spurt.
Mhm.
Um, and there is this situation that I encountered when I was an EMT. It wasn't my patient, but
Mhm.
it was the only time that I've ever seen this. I've never seen the hospital in such a tizzy. There's a
Mhm.
patient who came in with what is called an abdominal aortic aneurysm,
Oh, yeah.
which
Mhm.
typically this does not happen unless you're in like a major car accident or something really intense happens,
Mhm.
because your aorta, your abdominal aorta, which is going down,
Mhm.
servicing all of your abdomen and your lower extremities, um, it's like right in the core of your body, right in your
Mhm.
abdomen. It's very well protected. So typically it requires intense trauma. And this individual was a very, very old, very frail person.
Mhm.
But their wall of their aorta actually tore. There was a
Oh.
hole in it, right? And
Mhm.
typically, if this happens, they never reach the hospital because it's
Mhm.
so the pressure in the aorta is so unbelievably high that you bleed out within, seconds to minutes. Like it's usually like an immediate
Mhm.
concern.
Mhm.
In this case, it wasn't. It was a more minor
Thankfully.
one. But what you could see, and this is gnarly, so you could fast forward if you don't want to hear it, but it's cool for those of us who are really interested in medicine. You could actually see what essentially looked like a heart in this person's abdomen, because as the heart pumped and that blood at very high pressure flowed through the aorta, which again is in the middle of your body, because this individual was so frail and thin, every time the heart beat and you had that flood of high pressure, blood would come out, and it created a mass of blood in that individual's abdomen that would pulse every time the
Oh,
heart beat.
oh my goodness.
Isn't that gnarly? It was one of
I'm
the craziest things that
I
I've
am
seen
shocked. Wow.
in medicine in
I
general.
mean,
Very rarely do you ever see that, even if you work in the ER, because it's so rare
yeah.
for it to get all the way to the hospital. I can't
Wow.
tell you what happened to the patient. I was a EMT dropping off another patient, but that was like the most unbelievable situation that I could have imagined to visualize how high this pressure is.
Mhm.
It's that those walls are that thick because if something happens to them, that blood at such a high pressure is lethal, right?
Mhm.
You do not want to lose that because it will
Right.
push such a
So much.
large volume of blood out at such a strong
Mhm.
force,
Mhm.
right? That you've got a lethal problem on your hands very, very quickly.
Right. Wow.
Anyways, kind of gnarly, but
That is so gnarly. I mean, I think it's a great way. I mean, like that experience, well, I mean, for many it could be really traumatizing. But
yeah.
like really it helps to remember just the pressure gradients. Again, going back to pressure gradients that are in not only the respiratory system, but also in the circulatory system, right?
Yes.
Where you are always following that gradient, always going from high to low, but instead of that gradient being created normally in the lungs by negative pressure, it is very much in in the circulatory system by positive pressure. The heart's creating this really high pressure situation that's
Oh, that's
causing
a
it to
great
flow
point.
down its pressure throughout the circulatory system.
Hmm.
And a common thing and a common mistake I a lot of times see students where it's like, oh, the capillaries have the lowest pressure in the circulatory system because they think, oh, it's so thin, so low pressure. But in reality, venules and veins have even lower pressures than the
Hmm.
capillaries because again, we still need them to flow. So they always slow down their pressure gradient. Imagine if the venules and veins had higher pressure than the capillaries, would it ever leave the capillaries?
No.
No, it would just get stuck there. So as you go through the circulatory system, it just continually gets lower and lower, which is necessary in order for you to follow that pressure gradient in the circulatory system, which I think
I
is,
like
again,
that.
always think, again, that's why I always think that just when it comes to fluids, pressure gradients, like they just go so well, so well
Yes.
together.
And what you just said also explains the other side of the story, right?
Mhm.
I was talking about arteries and how thick those walls are, and you do not want those walls to rupture. On the complete opposite extreme, we could think about veins.
Mhm.
Veins, as you've described, have the lowest pressure, and it needs to be the lowest pressure. But imagine the blood that's at the tip of your toe.
Mhm.
Now we go from a capillary into a vein, and we have the lowest pressure, and now we have to counteract gravity to get fluid back up to the heart. How can we do that? How can we make sure that we don't backflow, right?
Mhm.
This is a key feature of veins,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Which is
And so this
valves.
is actually one thing I actually had an experience with when I first started, I don't know, first started teaching, but really I used to teach like 12 hours a day. Like it was
Oh
like
my
9
gosh.
to 9 straight. I would do so much tutoring and classroom work that
Ooh,
I would be sitting like at my desk all day. And so what would end up happening is because I was sitting, I would get my feet would swell up. This is so TMI, but my
mhm.
feet would get so swollen, right? Because I was just sitting. Because I was actually concerned because I was teaching MCAT, so obviously I knew exactly why this was happening. Because
Yeah.
normally, right? Normally when we're walking, we don't have backflow because we have these veins and venules, right? That have valves. These
Mhm.
valves keep our blood from flowing backwards, but they don't actually, they keep it flowing one direction, but they don't actually help a lot with bringing it forward. They just keep it from going backwards. But
Yeah.
when we think about our legs and feet, though, right, we just talked about how our veins and venules have such low pressure, right? Really,
Mhm.
really low pressure. So if you have this really low pressure in your legs and feet, sure, it's not going to go backwards, but how are you going to get it to go forwards is the key, right?
Mhm.
And this is the role of skeletal muscle. I always kind of think of like a yogurt tube squeezing, like I don't know, and maybe Americans have this, right? Gogurt or something, right? Where you
Yeah.
like
Go-gurt.
squeeze the
Yes.
tube, like where you like squeeze the yogurt out of the tube. This is what happens in your legs. This is why sitting is actually really, really poor for your circulation so much because when you're sitting, yes, you have the valves keeping the blood from flowing backwards, but if you don't have any driving force bringing it up, it's going to pull. You're going to cause a lot of pressure at that point because there's going to be so much buildup of blood that the fluid is going to go down its gradient. However, it's not going to stay in the circulatory system. It's going to flow out into the tissues. And this is why we see edema a lot of the times with people who are very, very kind of sedentary lifestyles, or me, who was just again sedentary
Teaching for too
lifestyle,
long.
sitting for way too long. And how our body solves this is by using skeletal muscle to cause that pressure to kind of apply pressure to the veins and venules to squeeze the blood back up to the heart. Because again, it always follows its pressure gradient. But when you have that low pressure, because it needs to go down its pressure gradient, we've got to get back to the heart. So this is why like compression stockings are a big thing. But also why if you don't do this, you have something called varicose veins occur. Because if you leave that blood sitting there on those valves, I mean, valves are not that strong. Like eventually, like under all that fluid that's trying to hold up, it will tear, it will break. And so this is where you get like a backflow of blood, which is you see them actually very visually by these very squiggly venules and veins, which I think
Interesting.
which is very, very interesting. Yeah, no, it was something that like I remember when it was happening with me. Like I was like, again, I'm a young guy. I generally think I'm active, but I was just sitting so often that
Yeah.
I like was like I need to start actually walking more. And lo and behold, as soon as I actually made sure I was like walking and standing and moving around, oh, my swelling was gone. Right? It's just because I was
Look
just
at
so
you.
sedentary.
Yeah, and I think that's very, very fascinating to think about when you're sitting, you don't have that muscular contraction.
Mhm.
Some people also think about it if you have to stand for a
Mhm.
long period of time. And you
Mhm.
could think about it the same way. right? When you're sitting, you don't have any muscular tension because your legs are not supporting your weight, right? When you're standing and you're not moving, right? Think about if you had to just stand for an hour. You're probably going to start shifting your weight from side to side. You might like kind of walk around a little bit. You might pace. Doing that is going to allow those muscles to squish, right? It squishes upwards and it shoves that blood back up to the heart. It forces it out of its way by applying pressure to the sides of that vein, or venule, but vein especially. And because it's got those valves, which by the way, if you're less familiar, right, it's a one-way door. It opens, in this case, upwards. But if water or blood, in this case, started to flow backwards, it would close off, right? It cannot flow both ways. Water can only flow one direction. If you're standing for a long time and you're not, like you have constant tension, but it's essentially the same thing as sitting all the time. You don't have that squeeze, relax that you have when you're in motion. And that's why it could be very dangerous. And actually, you can faint. You could faint because ultimately you have so much blood pooling in your legs, right? Or your extremities that it's not getting up to your brain and you can actually faint. So I think that's really cool. And of course,
thanks for saying my edema was cool, Molly.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And it's also something that you see a lot in the medical community when the heart is not capable of pumping blood with sufficient pressure to make it on its way back up to the heart, right? So we also see pretty extreme, we say peripheral edema, right? Which is just in your periphery, right? Especially in your lower extremities, like your feet and your legs. We see really significant swelling with individuals who have congestive heart failure, right? If your heart is failing and you just do not have a strong enough contraction to create adequate blood pressure to have proper circulation, you see very extreme swelling in the extremities, especially the feet and the ankles. And this is because that fluid is, again, it's pooling down there, increasing the pressure and essentially forcing that fluid out of the vasculature into the tissues. So you guys will learn about it in medical school. In fact, you'll learn about a lot of this stuff in medical school. And in future episodes of the podcast as well.
Yeah, you will.
Yeah. But really, really interesting to think about the applications of this material.
Right. And this is, again, comes back to our goal of why we want to talk about this. We're not here to lecture you. We're not here to make it so, oh, wow, I have to sit through an hour of these guys talking about circulatory respiratory system. We want to make it so that you understand how these systems work, so that when, no matter what scenario that you see, you can apply these fundamental principles, right? We don't want to memorize these systems. We want to understand how they work, not only for your role in the MCAT, but for your role as future physicians, because it's understanding these things that will actually help you to treat your patients. And so I think that kind of like leads us well to kind of chat about what we will learn about next episode, Molly.
Yeah. So again, every episode is meant to build on each other. We talked about fluids and fluid movement. In this episode, we talked a lot about fluids and fluid movement in the context of biology, but we've left out a pretty key component of this question, which is why? Why does oxygen move into the bloodstream and why does carbon dioxide move out? Why does our blood maintain a pretty stable, let's say, pH gradient, right? We know we have a lot of proteins in our blood. Proteins like consistent temperature, pH, salinity, right? How much salt is in our blood. All of that stays very consistent. And even regulating like our blood pressure, for example, is very tightly controlled by the body during in a process called homeostasis, right? We want to stay consistent, right? We don't want our bodily conditions fluctuating rapidly. We want to keep things very consistent and attain what we think of as an equilibrium, right? So our next episode, in kind of extending what we talked about today, is going to be homeostasis, which again is how the body kind of keeps itself at its optimal conditions. And then also equilibria, which is going to be more of a gen chem topic than a bio topic. We kind of ping pong from
sure, of course,
like a physics and chemistry to a bio and biochem and back. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about things like why hemoglobin binds to oxygen, right? And again, why oxygen and carbon dioxide move the way that they do. We'll also talk about things like the bicarbonate buffer system and
Love me
how
buffer system.
I love me a buffer system too. We'll talk about how your breathing rate is going to change in response to different pHs in your blood and vice versa, right? We'll talk about a lot of fun applications
Get
next
excited because
episode.
I know my heart's beating. I'm like, oh, we're getting ready to go. My sympathetic nervous system's activating. Hint for like way down the line when we may talk about that. But yeah, no, I'm excited. Looking forward to it. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I know it's always a blast chatting with you, Molly, and I'll see you next episode. Yes.
Yeah, hopefully with another can of Fresca. Someone
Yeah.
please sponsor Mike.
Oh, absolutely will. All right.
Yes. I'll
See you
bring a
later.
tetrapod to the next one.
Please don't. What?
Technically, you're a tetrapod, so.
I don't want to think about that.
Okay, until
All
next
right.
time, everyone, have a
See you
wonderful
later.
rest of your day or
All right.
whatever. Happy studying. We'll see you in the
Bye
next one.
now.